Hello. Today we'll be speaking about leisure needs. Chapter 4. First, we'll begin by speaking about John Newlinger's paradigm. We've previously learnt about him. John Newlinger was one of viewed as the fathers of social psychology of leisure. We'll then speak about the origin of needs, and then specifically leisure needs. We will then look at perceived freedom and control in life and how it is related to leisure, and finally discuss 4 theories that use freedom and control and how these then can be applied to leisure activities. So in 1974, John Newlinger wrote a book, The Psychology of Leisure, in which he developed a typology that he called a leisure paradigm. It looks at the dimensions of perceived freedom and intrinsic motivation. And so the purpose really is to predict when an activity or episode would be construed as some type of leisure or non-leisure by the individual. And in this, perceived freedom was viewed as most important for something to be viewed as a leisure experience. So this is the paradigm, and you can see that we have perceived freedom, which can be constrained or free, and we have type of motivation, which can be extrinsic or intrinsic. And I'll come back to this model in more detail in a bit. So perceived freedom, then, is a state in which the person feels that what she or he is doing is done by choice and because one wants to do it. So everyone knows the difference between doing something because one has to and doing something because one wants to. So free choice, then, is really like perceived freedom. And we may not actually always have total free choice, but we can perceive that we do. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. So then we have type of motivation. And motivation can be viewed, categorized in various ways. We'll be learning more about motivation in the next unit. For now, we're going to discuss intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, forms of motivation that you've probably heard before. So intrinsic motivation is the rewards for participation that are seen as coming from engaging in the activity itself. Whereas extrinsic motivation is when you're doing an activity more because it leads to some sort of external reward or something that is outside of the activity. Whereas intrinsic motivation can also be doing things, purely for things that are inside yourself, like self-development. Extrinsic motivation, though, is when we are often actually really motivated by extrinsic reasons, such as money, in a job, grades, how often maybe, for example, would you really do a certain project if it wasn't in order for a grade? You may do things for recognition in part or rewards, or awards. Sometimes we also participate in things not because we want to, but because we're trying to avoid things like threats of punishment. Or, you might get kicked out of school for not doing an assignment, or you may have your parents who would not appreciate if you didn't do a certain activity. And we may do it for evaluation or deadlines, and also, just out of a sense of obligation. So back to Newlinger's paradigm here. When people perceive freedom, then they experience leisure. So pure leisure, then, according to Newlinger, is when an activity is perceived to be freely chosen and motivated for intrinsic reasons. And I'll be giving some examples of these in the next couple of slides. Whereas pure job, they're really the activities that are experienced as the least leisure-like. An individual has no choice about participating and is motivated by extrinsic reasons. Pure work is when people have little or no choice, but they're participating for intrinsic motivation. And finally, leisure job is when activities are engaged in for extrinsic reasons, but that they are freely chosen. So, some examples. First, we'll think of my job as a prof. Well, I have to say I'm quite intrinsically motivated. You wouldn't, I don't think, be able to do, all the education and stuff if you were not somewhat intrinsically motivated to be an academic. However, if I was not getting paid, I would likely, not do this job. I'm not going to do the job for volunteer. So when it comes right down to it, my main motivation is extrinsic. However, when it comes to perceived freedom, I feel free. I, do have perceived freedom. I have perceived choice and freedom, in my job, I feel, under obviously some boundaries. But for the most part, I feel free, and I do obviously have enjoyment as well. So for me, my job then is a leisure job, and I think, I'm not sure if we would ever really have a job that would be pure leisure, because when money comes into play, it's always different, and you do have to provide for yourself. However, I think having a lot of people really experience, not enjoyment, or they feel constrained in their job. So I think it's always wonderful if you are able to then have a leisure job as your employment. Then when I think of my activities that I view as pure leisure, I think of gardening. I'm a vegetable gardener. I've always really liked swimming, from being a little kid. And, I did synchronized swimming. I was a synchronized swimming coach as well. I love crafts and crochet, and although I did enjoy this in childhood, I'm, again, as a parent, like really into Lego, and I make like medieval castles and stuff and my own designs. Anyway, with my kids, or just beside them. But these are things that I right now view as pure leisure. So I participate, for my love of these activities. It's obviously for intrinsic motivation. I have, it's either self-development, or, for all of these activities, I would say, I experience flow in them. And I have total freedom in these activities, total sense of perceived freedom. So therefore, they're pure leisure activities. As an example, when I think of like volunteering, so I've done a lot of community gardening and not-for-profit and volunteering in St. John's over the years. And, obviously I'm motivated. These are intrinsic motivation. It's obviously by choice that you often volunteer. I mean, except for perhaps, I guess, in high school when you're required to volunteer for, course credit, which, by the way, this paradigm is actually viewed as, does doing volunteering for course credit reduce your intrinsic motivation to further volunteer? But that's an aside. So I'm, motivated for the love of gardening and socializing in this, creating community, and the desire to share skills and teach. But I do feel constrained in volunteering, especially when you're really deep into that role. Like, for example, I got myself being like the executive director of a not-for-profit. And so you do feel a sense of commitment, and it can feel work-like. There are certainly times when you don't really feel like going to the meeting or the event, or having to fulfill a commitment. So these activities then, for me, volunteering, I would view it as pure work. It is intrinsically motivated, but I do feel constrained. And finally, when I was a child, my dad is a very big golfer, and he golfs since he was a teenager, and he's in his 70s now. And as soon as I was able, I remember going out and my dad, having me putt and try to hit a ball. And after a while, as I got a bit older, the club my parents belonged to, there were classes. And so I had to do that. And, sometimes I'd golf with my dad, and it got, especially around the age of like 11, 12, 13, it became, my dad really, really wanted me to participate a lot in golfing, which, by the way, I did not particularly like. I was motivated mostly because I didn't want to disappoint my dad, and I, that was really it. I didn't particularly find golf that enjoyable. Mostly, I particularly didn't feel like a sense of community really with the kids there anyway. And also, I was obviously constrained. My perceived freedom was constrained. My parents told me I had to participate. I really had no choice. And many people really feel extrinsic motivation and feel constrained in their employment, really. And that's probably why, that's why we often contrast employment with leisure, pure job with pure leisure. But as I've already mentioned, in your employment, you can experience leisure job. Another example would be people also often feel that housework is, a pure job sometimes. And also, activities can also move along with this. So, for example, cooking. Sometimes when I have to cook, I'm constrained. I have to cook, or my family has to cook because we have children. I have to feed them. I can't just tell them to, make something for themselves, or go to the store, or go to a restaurant or something. So, and sometimes it is, so the type of motivation is extrinsic. Like I have to, because, to meet my obligation as a parent. So that's a pure job. However, that another time it could be intrinsic. For example, I might be motivated to learn a new recipe or something. So that's intrinsic motivation. But again, my perceived freedom is constrained. Whereas another time I could be cooking and it's intrinsic motivation. I'm just really feel like doing it. And my perceived freedom is perhaps, high because maybe I don't have to. Maybe it is that my family has gone away for the weekend and I'm just cooking for myself, for example. Now, I'd like you to know, in my family, my husband is the chef, and so I don't know, not very often would I don't often cook just for leisure, more to be with family, I guess. Next is origins of needs. So we obviously have different types of needs. As obviously we have biological needs. These are physiological drives that are essential for our survival. We have the biological need for hunger, sleep, thirst. A lot of people would argue too that we have a biological need for touch, and that people that well, all like kind of mammals do, really. And there's also argument now that we have biological needs also for being outside, for nature. And then we have learned needs. These are acquired then through interactions with the social and physical environment. So, and throughout the world, or depending on your culture, your community, your socialization, your family, all those different aspects, your needs, you have different learned needs. Not everyone's needs are the same because they're learned from the environment. And so this could be like achievement, self-determination, self-actualization, even in a way sometimes optimal arousals even could be viewed, an affiliation, a sense of identity. These, having an identity in a certain thing is really a learned need. And thirdly, we have, I wanted to say when it comes to like physiological needs, we also have optimal level of arousal as an example. Some people view it as a physiological need. And you recall that, the optimal, in this model, it's looking at that we have a certain level of arousal, whether it be low to high, and we have a need for novelty, variety, and change, low to high. And somewhere in the sweet spot in the middle is then the optimal range. And there's been a lot of research that, this is physiological because a lot of it has to do with, hormones and neurochemicals. And I guess our reaction to it is, you can have your reaction to, those hormones and chemicals then is what motivates you then to have do a certain activity in order to increase or decrease your optimal level of arousal. There's of course a lot of agreement or lack of agreement, about physiological needs, and there's very many different theories about how, what are the real psychological needs that we have. Not physiological, psychological. The main ones that many of us, many psychologists do agree upon, the three core needs, this is by, DC and Ryan, and they are really then looking at the main needs of humans are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And these are the three core needs that are essential to growth and well-being. Now we'll go through each of these individually. So autonomy, that is the freedom to initiate one's behavior through personal choice and control. So that's obviously related to perceived freedom, your sense of autonomy. So a lot of people then perceive freedom is viewed then as a core need, that humans want to have a psychological need to have a sense of choice and control. And so this is very important then in understanding human behavior and also how to motivate people. Secondly, a core need is competence. So this is the effective functioning resulting in our desire to conquer even bigger challenges. Think about, human civilization as it is today would not exist if it wasn't for our desire for competence. We have, gone from being, cave dwelling, all the way, to now having, high technology and science. And this is all a result of our constant striving to be, learn and to conquer, really, and, to our desire to explore. So again, it is viewed then our wanting to grow and be competent in things is a core need that we all seek and strive for. And finally, we have relatedness. So this is like, do you feel a sense of relatedness, a sense of social connection to others? People need to feel that they are loved, and they are connected to others. People have the need to feel that others understand them. And people have a need to feel that they are meaningfully involved with the broader social world in which they live. So not just having, friends and family support, but having a sense of community, and I think maybe in today's society, even like a sense of like where you are even in the global world or in the global society. So, and we know then that relatedness is very much a core need. And for example, even on primates, they have studied this, where they've, taking monkeys and isolating them. This was, I don't think they do these types of experiments anymore. This was before a lot of human and animal ethics. But they isolated monkeys where they were not able to see others, and many of them died because they believe that we have a need for relatedness. And this is also very important when it comes to recreation and leisure, and understanding how to motivate people, because related to this need. People often participate in activities in order to feel a sense of belonging and a sense of relatedness. And that is really how you attract people, to activities, to participation, and really keep them coming. Another view of needs, though, is, of course, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm sure you have all heard of this multiple times. It might be one of the most cited theories in all of psychology, because it's used and applied in, economics and business and, every field, really. So Maslow viewed that we have these lower end needs and higher level needs. So the lower end needs kind of viewed as being physiological. So, this is the, hunger, thirst, sleep, some would argue sex. And then next is safety and security. Obviously, having a place to sleep, having, shelter, food security, etc. And then the higher level needs are more our sense of belonging and love, ego and esteem, and finally self-actualization. And he viewed kind of that we kind of go through then this hierarchy. However, this model has not ever been scientifically proven. There's no clear evidence that human needs can be separated into 5 distinct categories, or that those needs are even structured into any hierarchy. For example, this is a very kind of elitist Western white male way of viewing needs. For example, there are many places in the world where they might not have some physiological needs being met, or even safety and security. But that does not mean that they don't have, they cannot also be having a need and, having that need met when it comes to belongingness and love, or esteem, probably, or self-actualization. We don't necessarily go through this hierarchy all the time. Of course, it makes sense that if you have your physiological and safety and security needs established and very, that those would make it easier to meet the higher level needs. But it does not necessarily mean that it always goes in this, top-up direction. But this is useful for planning. It's a framework for specifying when and under what conditions leisure will become important to people. So, for example, it might not be necessarily helpful to, you're not going to go in and put in, let's say, a sports arena in a place that, doesn't have food security yet. So when it comes to leisure needs, what do researchers study? They really look at what arouses, energizes, or activates leisure behavior. So we're really then looking at what are the forces within a person that push them to engage in certain behaviors. So that's really kind of the person point of view. But we also want to look at the pull factors. So these are what are the characteristics of a leisure activity or the setting or environment that pull people to select certain activities. And so this is more the environment point of view. And really, we have, researchers have also there's argument and all these different theories about how many different leisure needs or even human needs there are. Some people say there's 40 needs and motives. People have identified a very small number of, leisure needs. So there really is no agreement. And just as an example, a very common scale that is used is by Tinsley and Cass, which was developed in the 70s, and that has 44 leisure needs, but grouped into 8 different types. And then, in contrast, there's another survey scale called the Recreation Experience Preference Scale, which has 19 categories. But a simple kind of view of this push and pull view of, what are things that push us to activities or pull us to activities is the leisure needs model by Seppo Azuola. In this, he is stating in this model that the reasons people participate can be categorized into 2 basic motivational dimensions: seeking and escaping. We seek and we escape. So, seeking could be, I guess, I don't know if that's the push or the pull, but we also then, he was viewing this, that we seek and escape both personal and interpersonal environments and rewards. So personal, meaning that it's within yourself. Interpersonal, meaning that it has a social nature to it. And environments then are, more things outside of ourselves, whereas rewards would be, specific needs that we are seeking. So when it comes to seeking then, people then participate in order to seek often novelty or change from daily life. So we're being pulled to activities to seek this novelty or change. So when we're seeking personal rewards, we're often then looking at seeking self-determination, a sense of competence, challenge, learning, exploring, or even relaxation. And examples might be like when you're seeking personal rewards, you might be advancing your skills. You might be volunteering, training for a triathlon, or taking a non-credit education course. So in all of these, advancing your skills, you're seeking maybe a sense of competence, or volunteering, you're looking at maybe self-determination, training for a triathlon, and you're challenging yourself. Taking a non-credit education course, you're learning. So this is all, doing things often for these are intrinsic motivation reasons. But we also might seek social contact and connectedness. So, we're seeking a sense of relatedness. If want to look at this as connect it to the 3 core needs. So, in a leisure activity that you might be doing when you're seeking interpersonal rewards is, I don't know, you might host a party. You might join a club, like a running club, or a student society club, or a gardening club. And in that, you're in a leisure experience, but you're obviously not just doing it to be by yourself, but you're wanting it to have social contact. That's why we go out with friends, or, often team sports is really about relatedness and about seeking social contact and a sense of connection with others. But we do often escape. So people also have a need to escape from their everyday life and stress. When it comes to interpersonal environments, so interpersonal meaning like social, we are then really escaping the social world. So this is escaping coworkers, like your family or your friends. And so, for example, you might decide to go on vacation to escape interpersonal environments. And I remember, for example, my mother-in-law, every year she really enjoys going on a little vacation herself. And the first time that this happened, I guess, or that my sister-in-law noticed, she was very upset, and she thought that our parents-in-law were getting divorced, because why would you ever go on vacation by yourself? But my mother-in-law, being the mother of 9 children, and had many grandchildren, obviously had a need to escape an interpersonal environment. Sometimes, and obviously these are just kind of examples of things from my life, but, sometimes, in order to escape social world or what's going on in the world, you might binge watch a Netflix series. Or some people like to read and get into again, it's similar to watching television or a movie, getting into a different world. Or knitting. You're, again, it's doing something kind of solo. If you want to, there's obviously knitting clubs, and in that case, you're seeking interpersonal rewards. But when you're really wanting, sometimes you want to escape, so you might knit, just by yourself, and it's very a solo and concentrated, activity or experience. And we also, pardon me, I'm not sure what happened to that slide, but we might also escape personal environments. So personal environments are personal problems, troubles, difficulties, or failures. And I'll repeat that. So escaping personal environments might be personal problems, troubles, difficulties, or failures. So, failing an exam, or having troubles, with a family member, or they're going through a pandemic. These are types of, personal stresses. So examples then of these types of activities are you might do, something to relieve stress like yoga or meditation or going for a walk. Others might, you might go drinking. You might go out to the bar on Friday night after failing an exam. I put video games. I'm not saying that this is, always the people, the only motivation of video games, but, I've noticed that especially when I'm sort of trying to procrastinate for things like, that doing things like playing computer games and stuff is very easy to do. And again, it's procrastination, but I think it's also really about escaping some sort of obviously personal stress. Or you might, have coffee with a friend to escape a personal environment. It doesn't have those types of activities doesn't have to be antisocial. They can be social or solo activities. Next, we'll be speaking about perceived freedom and control in life and leisure. So, perceived freedom is very much like free choice, and I've already said this a few times now, but I'm stressing again. It's one of the most important characteristics for an activity to be characterized as leisure. Another view of freedom, though, is decision freedom. And that is that to have leisure, people must perceive that the social setting provides at least more than one opportunity for action. Meaning that, for example, I know in Newfoundland, I've heard this before, that, a lot of people may not have had decision freedom when it came to their leisure activities when they were in a small rural town. For example, maybe some of you would have loved to have played hockey, but the arena was too far away. So the environment did not provide that opportunity. So there isn't decision freedom then. So it's really important then for people. I mean, personally, I don't think that you have to have total decision freedom to experience leisure, but the point is having a sense of choice is important. And, it's also then sometimes the illusion of that choice, which we'll discuss momentarily. So here's an example. Csikszentmihalyi and Graf in 1980 looked at the experience of work and leisure in daily life. So this was an experience sampling method. Again, this is in the 80s. That means they were the participants carried pagers and they were beeped and they filled out like a little survey each time. So that was about the main activity they were engaged in when they were signaled, how free they felt to participate, and if they were intrinsically or extrinsically motivated. So this was kind of really looking at, in a way, Newlinger's paradigm. And so here on this figure, this is the frequency with which daily activities are voluntarily chosen. And so this is then where you can see here that when it comes to perceived freedom, work was the least freely chosen. You can see there the lowest there on the left, paid work. Not surprising. Whereas you can see on the right that leisure activities were the most freely chosen. And here they categorized the activities as active leisure. So, physically active, but also could be physically active, where passive leisure is, things where you're not actually engaged with the activity more, and that could be things like watching TV, playing video games, and then there's socializing as well. So a specific type, which I guess could be active, but it's not usually passive. It can't be a passive activity. Just a few interesting points. Now, remember, this was in 1980. They did find quite a few gender differences. Males, and we talked about this actually on another lecture, a very similar study. Males here rated most activities as more voluntary, like cooking and childcare. And for females, they experienced greater freedom of choice when leisure occurred outside of the home. And again, social roles. I'm not sure that we would see the same gender differences in different gendered, or more not stereotypical families. And then they also, here on this chart, this figure is looking at the frequency with which daily activities are intrinsically motivated. And work and obligatory activities were seen to be more extrinsically motivated, more than leisure. So obviously paid work, you're going there in the end really to get a paycheck. And then obviously like things you have to do, like personal care or household chores, I guess you don't have to, but eventually you're going to run out of dishes or have poor hygiene. So, you have to do those activities. And whereas in contrast, people experienced a lot more sense of, doing activities for the sake of itself when it came to active leisure, passive leisure, and socializing. Again, they found gender differences. Men perceived daily activities as more voluntary than women. So maybe, and I mean like daily activities like household chores and that sort of thing. And women had often kind of had conflict with their roles as, these people often were homemakers. So they didn't really experience, that much intrinsic motivation in these roles. Again, that was, I don't know if that's gender or just social roles. As I kind of alluded to earlier, when it comes to the perceived freedom, illusion of control is just as important as real control. So I mean like illusion meaning, that it's not real. So the illusion of control theory says that people have such a strong need for control that it leads them to perceive that they have control and freedom of choice, even when they do not. And actually, when you really think about it, I'm not really sure that we really have, how many things do we actually do in life that are totally free? They're really, even sleeping, it's not free. Like having a nap is, but it'd be kind of nice not to have to sleep all the time sometimes, if you didn't need to. So, and we could go down a list of many activities, how many things do you not really have to do? And maybe that's just out of a sense of obligation or that you have to provide for your family or yourself. But this theory is important for motivation. It's important to help, in behavior change and, to understand how to kind of point people to a certain behavioral path. And I'll give an example. I learned this theory, I guess, I don't know if it was in like Psych 101, maybe not, but I learned it when I took this course, Social Psychology of Leisure. Oh, look at that. Anyway, I used this a lot then when I became a parent. And for example, my children eat a wide variety of vegetables, in part, due to two reasons. One, something that I also learned in Psych 101, is that, the grimace that a baby shows when, you give a baby peas and they make that awful, a face or something, and might spit it out, that is actually just an evolutionary reaction, to making sure that something's safe and, not poisonous. So, you need to be introduced, a child, needs to be introduced to a certain food at least 10 times or more before that grimace or that actual reflex doesn't happen. And so, unfortunately, a lot of parents actually give children their, see them make that grimace and think they don't like it. But you have to keep persisting. So, I made sure that for each time I introduced a new food to my children, I gave it to them every day for, a couple of weeks to make sure that they became accustomed to it. So that's one thing about psychology that I can use for parenting. But I slightly digress. Here, for illusion of control, you could see, I don't say to my children, do you want to eat your vegetables or not? That would be true freedom. I do not give them real choice. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't eat the fruit vegetables. So, I provide the illusion of control for all things, really, when it comes to parenting. Would you like broccoli or cauliflower tonight for supper? We involve, my husband especially, he involves the children in the decision making about the food that we are cooking, and especially when they also get to help to make it, they will, it's a leisure experience actually as a family, then much more likely to have good nutrition. So, and as parents, you use this all the time about stuff. I use this with chores. You have to do a chore. Which of these 3 chores would you like to do? So, perceived freedom and control then are very important. We are always striving to be superior. It's a basic human response to attempt to control one's life and surroundings. We have really a motivation for competency, or it's called affectance. We want to exercise control just for the sake of exercising control. And I think most humans, we all have this. Obviously, some people have a need, we call them control freaks. That's, a different, I'm not talking about that, but we need to feel a sense of control in our environment. You're feeling when you're stressed, often one of my coping mechanisms is to try to feel a sense of order in my life again somehow, making sure checking my to-dos and my calendar and, getting things organized and cleaned and all that. So people strive to be causal agents. So that's like social agents or the origins of their own behavior. And so there's really then 3 theories of freedom and control that have important implications for leisure. So for each of these theories, you need to understand the theory and then also be able to apply it to a leisure example. So first we have psychological reactance, then we'll talk about the theory of substitutability very briefly, because we're actually going to talk about that again later in the term. Learned helplessness, which is also really broadly the theory of locus of control. And then finally, self-efficacy theory, which is, really a part of social cognitive theory. So psychological reactance. Psychological reactance is a state of motivational arousal resulting from an attempt to regain freedom generated when there is a threat to or loss of freedom. And what I mean by that is that individuals have a specific set of freedoms. We have specific things, like we expect certain actions, we have specific thoughts and feelings, and that we feel free to exercise. And we're socialized to expect these things, to have these freedoms. And so when a specific freedom is eliminated or threatened, we are motivated then to get that back. So I'll go back to the beginning where, what is psychological reactance? A state of motivational arousal resulting in an attempt to regain freedom when you have threat or loss of that. So when you have a freedom or something that you think is your right and it's taken away, you are very motivated to get that back. So this kind of reactance is going to be higher or stronger under 4 conditions. By this, be a good multiple choice question to understand these and be able to apply it to a specific situation. So, for example, when an individual has learned to expect to have this particular freedom, we then will have higher or stronger psychological reactance. So, when we have become accustomed to something. Also, when freedom that is threatened or eliminated is important to us. Obviously, you're not going to really care as much about something that's been taken away from you if it's not really that important to your life or to you. Thirdly, we will have higher psychological reactance if the freedom is totally removed rather than threatened. So, meaning that if, it's been like completely taken away rather than just kind of, like threatened to be taken away, for example, like a parent, I'm taking away, your car keys. You can no longer drive the car. That is completely removed. Threatened is, if you don't pull up your grades, I promise that I'm going to take away the keys to the car. That is being threatened. Your view that it's your right to drive the family car. If the threat to the freedom has negative impacts on other areas of life, you'll also have psychological reactance. And I'm going to talk about this in the next slide, but I'm going to give sports as the biggest example, and injury in sports. So, and this is actually a lot what Douglas Kleber, my mentor and one of the authors of your textbook, he got interested in this area because he was studying. It was at university, and he had injured his knee, and then got interested in looking at identity. And, all the psychology behind, identity in being an athlete, especially when you've had a sports injury, and this kind of led him to look at negative life events and how we kind of transcend them sometimes through leisure. So in that case, Doug, he really hurt his knee. He obviously learned to expect to have the freedom to be able to run and to always be able to play football. He had to come to expect that. And here the freedom is threatened or eliminated is perceived as important. Obviously, he experienced flow in football. It was very important to his life. He had a sense of enjoyment. It had always been part of his life. Is the freedom totally removed rather than threatened? For example, is this in his case, his knee was seriously injured in that, it was definitely ending his varsity basketball career. In contrast to, if he had just had, was going to be on the bench for a couple of weeks or something, that would have been different. And then also, you look at athletes, like the threat to the freedom has negative impacts on other areas of life. Being especially, a varsity athlete, you are, you've obviously been doing that sport likely for a fairly long period of time. It is part of your life. You have a social group. It's not just like doing the sport together. You probably have leisure and socialization together. So having that role in your life removed, you would have strong psychological reactance. So other examples, you guys may never have actually even exercised your right to vote. But, if the prime minister waved a wand and said, hey, you now have to be 30 years old before you can vote in Canada, all of a sudden, you guys would all be up in arms and picketing, talking about that it was your right to be able to vote. I just talk about serious sports injuries. I think we've all had the experience of psychological reactance during the pandemic, not being able to participate in valued life activities during COVID, whether they be social, or leisure activities, whatever it is, work. We're very motivated often to get those things back. Whether some people have been, picketing or writing letters and hoping that things will reopen to government, where others, the psychological reactance is like, I'm following all the rules so carefully so that things will come back to normal. Next is the theory of substitutability, and I'm not actually going to go over this too much because we will be discussing this later in the term. But this is related to psychological reactance in that people are less willing. So substitutability means like, are you going to substitute something? Like, if I can no longer do one leisure activity, would I substitute it for something else? As an example, when I first developed chronic pain as a teenager, I'd played the flute, and music was a big part of my life. Whereas, so when I could no longer play the flute, I was willing to substitute. And luckily, there was a music store in town in Waterloo, and they let me try out different instruments for free and bring them home and test them out to see which ones kind of hurt my arm or not. And ended up with the guitar. And anyway, music has still been able to be a part of my life because I substituted. However, people are less willing to replace one leisure activity for another when the external pressure to substitute leisure behaviors results in psychological reactance that reduces one's willingness to substitute. So meaning that if your psychological reactance is strong because the threat that was removed was important, the threat was totally removed rather than the need, the activity rather than just threatened, whether if it doesn't affect other areas of your life, etc. If you have that psychological reactance, then it's going to reduce your willingness to substitute activities. So, for example, I've heard many stories of, now this isn't enough, let's say leisure, but you're not able to play your favorite sport anymore. Let's say it's injury or finances, and thus you kind of quit all physical activity altogether. You do see people like that. Or, I've heard of, professional athletes who become injured. They're no longer able to be, let's say, a Major League Baseball player. They stop even watching the sport on TV. They remove it totally from their life because of the psychological reactions that they're experiencing. They're not willing to substitute. Whereas other people, maybe they do have an injury, but they move on to, let's say, a role of coaching. And in terms of leisure, if someone with a wide variety of leisure skills, which we call a leisure repertoire, your repertoire of all your activities and skills you have, someone with a variety of skills is better equipped to handle threats or the elimination, of these, because you have you've got more activities in your toolbox, to be able to do. Next is learned helplessness. And this is the phenomenon in which we experience, uncontrollable events that you have. Like if you keep experiencing things that you can't control, it will create a passive behavior towards, subsequent threats to your well-being. This is really out of the theory of, locus of control theory. But basically, when people are, if you're constantly having failures, it leads people to attribute the uncontrollable events to your own personal failings. And you might develop low self-esteem and depression, learned helplessness. For example, if you felt that, like let's say you studied really hard all the time for the quizzes, and yet you constantly did not do well. If you attribute that you're not doing well because, you're not a good learner, you're not a good student, then you're going to maybe give up bothering to study. But maybe it's not anything to do with your studying. Maybe the quizzes, you don't have enough time, or the questions are too tricky, or, the prof didn't teach the course well. That would be, it's an outside factor. But the effect on leisure. When people constantly experience failure, they attribute that failure to their lack of personal ability. And so their persistence at that activity, their enjoyment in that activity is constantly reduced. If you're the kid who can never hit the ball and never gets picked on the team, eventually you are not going to enjoy that activity. And that's why it's important to minimize learned helplessness. And we even do this, with kids, for example, if you constantly correct someone or do something for them, then they eventually will think they cannot do it for themselves. So, and they will stop. Like learning to tie your shoe. If I don't take the time and be patient for my child to do it themselves, and if I always put their shoes on, they will think that I must think they're not able to. And so then they will stop attempting to. So this can also be used with parenting. And we also see this with people with disabilities. People tend to do things constantly for someone with a disability, believing, I don't know if they're just impatient or believing that that person can't do it. And if someone's always experiencing that, well, eventually that's going inside your head and inside yourself, thinking that you must not be able to do it. And eventually you stop persisting to bother to try. So there's a lot of strategies that we can use to minimize learned helplessness in leisure, recreation, and sport. First of all, non-competitive recreational leagues, just generally, not always focusing on competition. And this is especially very important, I think, and a lot of people think, especially when it comes to children. I think it should be more non-competitive leagues up to a certain point. I'm not really sure when, but I personally think it shouldn't be till 13, 14 should be competition. And even people like Wayne Gretzky agreed with that. Go get skills in a variety of things. Don't specialize at first. He didn't. Many of the great athletes didn't specialize, actually. Also, having formation of better balanced teams. You don't want to put it, for example, a child in a position where they're not doing well. Maybe it's because they're at a beginner level and you've put them on an advanced team. That's not their fault, but they might attribute their lack of skill in that sport or activity or class because they're in a high, in the wrong level. So having, balanced teams and that kind of thing. That's why, a good coach often doesn't let people. You don't let people pick teams when you're having like a practice, you are maybe creating a balanced teams. And also, obviously, focusing on personal success and skill development rather than competition. And putting perspective on winning and losing. And then kind of shows that, people won't view it as to personal failure. And finally, self-efficacy theory. So this was by Bandura. It's part of social cognitive theory. And it is a person's belief that he or she is capable of a specific behavior required to produce a desired outcome in a given situation. Meaning, do you think you can do it? And I want to point out that this is situation specific, meaning we can have general self-efficacy, but there's also lots of types of self-efficacy. For example, there's test-taking self-efficacy. How confident are you in your ability to write an exam? There is exercise efficacy. How confident are you in your ability to participate in, moderate to vigorous physical activity 3 times a week for the next 4 weeks? Do you believe you're capable of that? There is, like I could keep going on. There's, you name a behavior, and there's some research, and someone made a name about it called something efficacy. But here we're just talking about general self-efficacy. So self-efficacy judgments really influence how much effort we put into the persistence in face of obstacles or adverse experiences. And so, how despite obstacles, barriers, challenges, are you still going to feel that you are capable and keep trying, even when things don't go well? So, and this self-efficacy is actually viewed as, a big motivation behind many of our behaviors. This expectation, of personal control and to persist. So how can we increase self-efficacy expectations? Many things. Well, we, and this is about behavior modification. And you can approach behavioral change in small steps to ensure success. For example, when I work with people with chronic pain, everything is very much step by step, very small steps. And this is important, especially a lot of people who have severe chronic pain. A lot of, for example, physical activity, it can really exasperate the pain, even a little bit of it, as if their body is deconditioned. So kind of the body has to get kind of gradually warmed up over quite a long time to get conditioning back so that they don't experience that. So then they'll experience, pain from exercise just normally. When I work with people, then it's like, and even with myself, you start down, first, people say, I can't go for a walk. Well, we'll start with, let's go just for a walk down the street, walk 4 houses and come back. The next time, walk 10 houses and come back. Then walk down the street, walk around the block. And you keep doing this until eventually, the individual can do a short hike, maybe they go for a walk for half an hour or 45 minutes, or then an hour. And, then small successes. And self-efficacy will definitely increase along the way. Another way is performance mastery. So this is making sure that people have foundational skills, that they can master the skill of that activity. You don't, when you take swimming, you don't just throw the kids in the deep end. You're first learning to blow bubbles, then float, and then, hold your breath under the water, be able to go under the water, do the front float, back throat, doggy paddle, and eventually you're moving up to strokes, etc. It's very, there's a progression to the mastery of skills. And so it's very important we make sure that people have this mastery, and think about it, the whole point of physical literacy, in physical education and, health education, is to make sure that children get the foundational movement skills, physical literacy skills. And that's also about confidence, self-efficacy, in order to be physically active for their whole life. And a lot of this came from our research when we look at girls. Females, the age, in teenagehood are most, or used to be anyway, most likely to drop out of sports, and around that age. And, I won't go in, there's a lot of different reasons, what to do with physical education curriculum focused on, competitive sports rather than health, and sometimes the focus, females prefer more socialization and personal growth and teamwork rather than competition, etc. We can go on about other reasons, but a lot of the reasons why they found out that girls were dropping out of sports is because they weren't able to do a lot of the activities. They wouldn't continue. And that's not because they didn't want to, but because they lacked the basic foundation. No one had really taught them how to properly throw a ball or something like that. So this really changed physical education curriculum and physical literacy. And, that's why many of you are, in this program. We can also have role modeling. So, watching others, having a mentor or a coach. And there's also reinterpretation of physiological symptoms. So meaning like rethinking what's happening to your body. So, for example, understand. Some people think that muscle soreness, they must have done something wrong. But, for example, I can remember thinking, and when I've worked with people with chronic pain, and now that you have to understand the different types of pain, but that some delayed onset, muscle soreness is natural from exercise, and it's just showing that you have worked, your muscles have worked. You don't want too much though, but, that's reinterpreting that symptom. That's not pain. It's showing that I used that muscle a little bit. And again, I'm not pointing to chronic, to severe pain, just mild pain. And then we also use social persuasion. So that's information and encouragement. We cheer people on, give them a pat on the back, positive feedback. This also increases people's efficacy in activities. So for the quiz exam, you need to understand that Newlinger's leisure paradigm. So, that there's perceived freedom, that's constrained or free, that we have extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, and those 4 outcomes, like pure job, pure work, leisure work. So, for example, I might give you a scenario. That scenario would describe a person in a leisure activity. And I'm going to I'm not going to come out and say that they're constrained or that they are extrinsically motivated, but I will give you a scenario, and from that, there'll be keywords that then you can just realize, is that person constrained or free? Is that person extrinsically or intrinsically motivated? And then you need to then answer, well, is it A, pure job, B, leisure job, C, pure work, or, D, pure leisure? You should also understand, obviously that we have a need for an optimal level of arousal. It's important, and by the way, I'm not sure if I've said this, but I believe I have. Again, I'm reminding you, understand is often, or identify is for a multiple choice, when I say discuss, that's kind of more short answer. So understand, DC and Ryan's theory that there's 3 core needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. You need to understand that Oswald leisure needs model, that we either seek or escape, and that we seek or escape personal and interpersonal rewards and environments. You should be able to tell me, like, define what is seeking a personal reward, what is seeking a interpersonal environment or whatever, and then provide an example of a type of leisure activity that someone might do in that if they are seeking or escaping one of those needs. Obviously, this whole lecture's been on really the need of perceived freedom and control. So obviously you got to understand the importance. And, we went through 4 theories that apply this importance of perceived freedom and control to behavior: psychological reactance, theory of substitutability, learned helplessness, and self-efficacy. And, so you should be able to I'm going to give you, let's say, another type of scenario, and you should be able to know if it's psychological reactance or learned helplessness or self-efficacy. Make sure you understand for psychological reactance, like, when is it stronger? And make sure you can discuss self-efficacy theory briefly, especially, how would we increase self-efficacy? And here are some of the terms that you should understand. Obviously, perceived freedom, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. You should also know the differences between the different types of needs, those terms: learned needs, biological needs, physiological needs. We also learned about decision freedom and the illusion of control. And, then all those other different theories obviously could be in a matching of terms. And that's the end of leisure needs. Next class, we'll be discussing then leisure motivation.